Hello and welcome to the Fortune and Freedom podcast, where Nigel Farage and Nikolai Hubble give you a unique take on what's really going on in the world of finance, investing, and politics. We hope you sit back and enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to This Week in Review with Nigel Farage. Nigel, not so long ago, central bank digital currencies were nothing but a twinkle in the eye of Chinese President Xi. Now they are UK government policy. What do you make of it?
Well, actually, the truth of it is that anyone that talked about central bank digital currencies was a conspiracy theorist. And of course, we have been talking previously here about this subject. Yeah, and we knew that up to 100 world governments had been discussing this. And of course, Jeremy Hunt, who's now our great globalist chancellor, well, it's no surprise that under his tenure, this is racing ahead at full speed. Andrew Bailey, well, he sort of goes with what everybody else wants to happen on the big world stage. So yes, by 2030, there will be a central bank digital currency called Britcoin. Now, you'll be told, don't worry, it's no problem. You'll be limited to begin with how much money you can have in it. Cash will not be abolished, but it's going to be so much quicker and so much easier for everybody to transact and cheaper to transact, and this is how the whole thing will be sold. And what you'll find, if this really does come into being, that by 2035, nowhere will take cash. A lot of places do not take cash, and the pandemic accelerated that. So, but don't worry, folks. Provided you're law-abiding, you've absolutely nothing to fear from this whatsoever. Just imagine you're a truck driver. You've been driving a truck for a living for 40 years. You've never had a speeding conviction. You've never broken the law. You've paid your taxes and been a good citizen. And suddenly the Canadian government decide that to carry on with your job, you have to have at least 2 vaccinations. So you now basically become a lawbreaker, and you decide to protest in Ottawa on the basis that what you're doing doesn't threaten anybody else because you're in the cab on your own. And it took them a bit of time, but they closed down their bank accounts. They froze their bank accounts. Well, just think, if you find yourself on the wrong side of a new law, you find yourself on the wrong side of something the government wants to do, at the press of a button, they can stop you being operational. Now, let's just say, as the climate hysteria continues, that we each have a carbon credit limit. Well, they might say, no, you can't book that aeroplane to Marbella. You've already been on 4 flights. So this could be used in all sorts of ways. It is a potential massive infringement upon our liberties and upon our freedoms. Quite how it's going to work between the banks and the commercial banks and the Bank of England, all of that needs to be thought through. But that they intend to do it, be in no doubt.
One of the key arguments is that there's no point doing this unless the government wants to be able to, impose some of those policies you've mentioned. And there's plenty of other examples like negative interest rates, which happened in a lot of the European banking system, and all sorts of examples around the world where governments have decided that in an emergency situation, because that's always the nature of the beast, they want to be able to do certain things. And right now they can't, and central bank digital currencies would enable them to. But they seem to not really be selling it to us yet. You've mentioned that the cheaper fees and the efficiency and things like that. The PR is pretty weak. I feel like people are very skeptical about this so far.
Yes, and I think actually if you were the government, this is exactly how you do it. You wouldn't present it as big bang, the whole world's going to change. You'd do it slowly and incrementally. And so little piece by little piece, there became a greater acceptance, a greater usage, as I say, more shops, etc., not taking cash. So no, I can see why they're doing it the way that they are. I really, really can. What it really says to me is this. Despite the FTX collapse, despite other failures that we've seen throughout the crypto space, despite the utter doom-mongering of the Financial Times, etc., this is the biggest Ponzi scheme the world's ever seen. Cryptocurrencies are potentially valueless, said Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England. And yet, you know what? The more we edge towards state central bank digital currencies, the more appealing cryptocurrency is. And I think probably the lesson from the story from 2022 is that rather than holding your crypto with an exchange, you need to be in a position where you are the custodian yourself of what you own. And I think this is the single most important lesson. And hey, this is volatile. These things boomed a couple of years ago, they fell by 80%. But it is interesting, I think, to see how relatively steady Bitcoin and Ethereum are, despite all that bad news in the market. And so I really still am very much of the belief that unless they close down the internet, which ain't going to happen, that these cryptocurrencies, at least some of them, are here for good.
So you mentioned one possible solution to this threat of central bank digital currencies. And depending on when you're watching this video, everyone at home, we're going to have a link to a report which lays out a whole bunch of other options that you might want to consider if you are worried about central bank digital currencies. But first, Nigel, I want to ask you on behalf of everyone, what are you going to do about this central bank digital currency threat? Because you're rather good at changing government policy when the government's on one tangent, when the people want something completely different.
Well, we're in a phase here of education. You can only really start to put pressure on members of parliament and then ultimately on government if you start to get a wider general education. What has been surprising, depressing over the course of this week is how little commentary these announcements have had amongst mainstream media. And it's a funny one, do mainstream media lead public opinion? Or does public opinion lead mainstream media? And with every situation, it's different. But certainly, what I'm going to try to do is to educate people as to the dangers, is to point out that this would be yet another massive, massive hike in the ability of the state to control your life, and that it really, really must be resisted in every way. And just as their campaign is a long campaign, our campaign equally will need to be a long campaign. We're talking about 2030 for the introduction. So yes, I'm going to be doing my best to try and educate people as to what the potential downsides of this are. The upsides, from what I can see, well, I mean, very, very little indeed. And I'm going to try, through members of parliament, to also get them to begin to understand this. So yeah, I'm on the case.
And that's why I've put together this report involving lots of solutions to the CBDC threat, which you can find below the video. I want to jump on something that you mentioned just now, which really caught my attention. You said that this globalist chancellor and Andrew Bailey just goes along with whatever people want at the globalist level. Why does that happen? Why do our leaders, once they get elected to effectively the highest office in their sort of arena, whether it's the central bank or the parliament, why do they suddenly go globalist once they attain those positions?
Do you remember seeing Donald Trump going to his first G7? And he took a different stance on a few issues. And there was Trump. And had Angela Merkel doing this. Leaders don't like to be unpopular. They like to go to the big global summits, G20s, COP26s, 7s, whatever it may be. And they want to be popular. They think if they're not popular, if they're not embraced, that it's a bad symbol for their country. And just every now and again, you get a Thatcher, you get a Trump who doesn't really mind too much. There's a lot of that going on. I mean, there is genuinely a lot of that going on. But you raise the point, and it's interesting because Liz Truss wrote a 4,000-word essay in the Sunday Telegraph last week. She's done a big interview with The Spectator. And this is Liz Truss saying, look, we may not have got everything right. We may have gone too far too fast. We may have been unaware of this LDI threat which emerged. And actually, who knew? I mean, who knew that this even existed? But we were in the right direction. We need to reduce the size of a state. We need to bring back incentives. So a lot of the narrative that Truss, and she may be the wrong messenger, but a lot of the narrative that Truss has produced in the last few days, I find myself in very, very strong agreement with. And it's interesting to see the Crispin Odys of this world, the sort of real successful entrepreneurs, a lot of them actually rallying to the Truss cause. Now, this doesn't help the Conservative Party's electoral prospects, because you've now got the Trussites, you've got the Sunak and Huntites, and you've got the Borisites, who take their glass of wine over a glass of water, like Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745 and the Jacobite Rebellion. So they're split all over the place. But there's one thing she hasn't explained. She said she sacked Kwasi Kwarteng because that would calm the markets. She hasn't given a single explanation of why, of all the people that she could have chosen, she picked somebody outside of her social circle, outside of her political and intellectual sphere. Why did she appoint Jeremy Hunt? She hasn't asked that question. And you know something? I'm the only person in British media that is asking that question, because somewhere there, Nick, lies the answer to your question.
Yeah, it's the moment everything changed, and you've talked about that before.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see, though, that the IMF, I think it was this time, has criticized the UK government for raising taxes and that being bad for growth. So, you know, Truss cut taxes, which was pro-growth, which was an absolute disaster, apparently.
Well,
now we've got the opposite, and that's an absolute disaster. And UK is going to be the worst economy, the worst major developed growing economy. So, you know, they're stuffed either way. So what's really going on here?
Look, this is year 13 of a failing government. You know, and to all outside observers, they can't do right for doing wrong. You know, listen, we shouldn't worry too much what the IMF say. They've never got a prediction right that I've ever seen. They've become increasingly a politicized organization, almost a branch office of the European Commission in terms of their support for the euro as a project. I once in the European Parliament actually held up the IMF Charter and said, you know, they should not be intervening in the euro. But hey, you know, they've become one of the great globalist structures. So I'm not too terribly worried either way what they say. The fact is that in 6 weeks' time, we have got a massive increase in business taxes happening in this country, a significant rise in dividend taxes, which affects not just investors, but also people running, you know, the local laundrette or whatever it may be. We have an absolute refusal to reconsider the IR35 rules. And one of the reasons lots of people in their 50s are packing up work is employers won't take them on as contractors for fear the taxman will come after them. And if you can't put genuine allowable expenses against what you do, what's the point of continuing? And you've also got a series of tax reliefs on reinvesting in your company that are also being slowly edged and dragged away. So the really important debate isn't what the IMF think in Washington. The really important debate is, you know, we're going to have a spring statement very shortly. And, you know, at least there is something of a conversation around growth. You know, is Hunt going to slightly change tack between now and that spring statement with regard business taxes, with regard investment reliefs? And that's kind of where the CBI are now. You know, the CBI, who generally represent more big business than small business, and that's true. But the real criticism of the tax policy, forget Washington, but it's now coming from small business and from big business. And we're making ourselves incredibly uncompetitive. And we're doing it at a time when on personal taxes, business taxes, and increasingly now inheritance taxes, we've got Portugal and we've got Italy poaching in the young entrepreneur market in the United Kingdom. And so, you know, the one takeout, and again, nobody will talk about this. I mean, you know, the sheep, the herd that is British media, they don't even understand this stuff because, you know, they're all in Westminster together in the pub all day. I mean, I don't mind going to the pub, but, you know, they don't see outside of that. And you know, we've got the beginning for the first time since 1978 of a brain drain in this country. So I am hoping that Hunt will listen to some of this stuff. Otherwise, and yes, there'll still be people working hard and setting up companies and doing things, but it just won't happen on the scale that it could in a more positive and encouraging environment. So we need to look ahead to that spring statement, look ahead to the 1st of April when all of these taxes change. And these are really, really important markers for how the United Kingdom will do relative to other countries for the next few years.
In the midst of all this gloom, the FTSE 100 has hit an all-time high. How do you explain that combination?
Well, of course, a lot of the FTSE income, most of the FTSE income doesn't come from this country. you shouldn't really think of the FTSE index as an index of British industry in the way the old FT30 used to be all those years ago. It's a reflection of currency movements. The weak pound, in many, many ways, has boosted overseas earnings, dividends, and that's what it's a reflection of. Having said that, I mean, the markets have started the year in a very, very buoyant mood. I wouldn't be buying indices at these numbers, personally. I think there is a great feeling that inflation's about to disappear, China's back up and running, the figures coming out are not quite as bad as everybody thought. We're not yet in recession. It's all going to be okay, tax receipts, etc. I still think that the situation in Ukraine is bleaker than it's been at any point in the last year. We're almost exactly a year now since the invasion began. We've got, Zelensky in London this week. Clearly, we're going to send jet fighter planes. We're not sending personnel to fight, but we're doing pretty much everything. But Boris Johnson thinks we should send every single fighter plane we've got. I mean, what he's smoking, I've no idea. But there is an escalation in the war in Ukraine, and Putin allegedly has recruited 500,000 young recruits. Whether that number's true or not, I don't know. But clearly a lot of young men have been recruited. I mean, it seems almost incredible that these are 1917 style battles. Trenches, heavy artillery bombardment, massed infantry assault. It seems almost incredible that we're talking about a Western Front type scenario, but we are. And Putin can't afford to back down. He simply cannot afford to back down. Now, I've talked to a lot of military experts in the last few days who tell me that a lot of Russia's kit is seriously substandard, that the level to which their troops are being trained is very poor, and that actually the equipment that we're sending out, used correctly, the Challenger tanks, etc., all 14 of them, but used correctly, will make a very, very big difference. We will have to see, but I think it's pretty certain there'll be a big spring offensive, and that things in Ukraine are going to get bloodier and nastier and worse, with bellicose threats and all the rest of it. And that's why I still think that the consensus view from those who didn't see inflation coming, then said it would be transitory, then panicked and ramped interest rates, now tell us, oh, God blimey, Governor, thank God for that, it's all over. I still think inflation, I think there is a risk still of oil price shocks and a risk of inflation being worse this year than people think. That's where my mind, Nick, is at the moment.
Especially if the weather worsens. Our mutual friend Jim Rickards, he wrote a monthly issue in his newsletter describing exactly how World War III could start and making his readers realize just how close we are. And then he went off to Antarctica on a boat, which has me a bit worried at the moment. But his description is that it's all about tit for tat. So nobody just launches a nuclear warhead. The idea is that you escalate, the other side escalates, you escalate, the other side escalates, and eventually you get to the point where both sides are backed into a corner, and that's where things get really dangerous. And it seems to me that the UK is playing that game exactly as Jim Rickards has described it. In fact, we're leading that game exactly as Jim Rickards described it. My question to you is, how do we get off? Where's the off ramp? I mean, I don't understand how this tit for tat escalation can end.
I mean, interestingly, there was almost unanimity in Parliament in both houses when Zelensky went and addressed them in Westminster Hall. So whenever I see a total consensus in politics, I start to get slightly alarmed because, I mean, look, whatever the background and history of all of this, and I've spoken about that much in the past, and I did predict this war in 2014 in the European Parliament. I actually predicted it on the floor of the House. There will be a war. Of course, they all hated me for it, and they hate me for it now. I'll be honest with you, I just don't know. What I do feel, as I said already, is that it's going to get bloodier and nastier in the next few months than it's been at any point. But if we're serious with our aims, such as retaking Crimea, well, seems to me this war could drag on for many, many years. That's currently how I see it. As for how you stop escalation, I just don't know.
Neither do I, but thanks for joining us, Nigel, and everyone at home, thanks for watching.